We are back, ladies and gents, with another video from the video game guy. So let's talk about Final Fantasy Rebirth, a game with diehard fans and a hardcore following that spans over multiple decades. A game who some might say is revolutionary or was revolutionary for its time, and the best installment in the whole franchise. Final Fantasy Rebirth. It set out to be bigger, better, and superior to its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII the Remake. Did it live up to the hype? Was it all it set out to be? And most importantly, did it deliver? Let's find out. Warning, there may be some spoilers.
I'm waiting, Cloud.
So with so much to talk about, let's start off with what the game does right. For starters, the majority of Final Fantasy takes place outside of Midgar this time, which is the main setting in the last game. The game takes you on a wild adventure throughout many different regions, and each region gives you beautiful visuals, a sense of discovery, and adds to the thrill of the adventure you have set out on. The game picks up right where you left off in the last one and immediately raises a few questions. I do suggest you look up some recap videos if you haven't already. The first chapter of the game is going to immediately capture the audience with an intense opening that is meant to pay homage to the original 1997 version. Fans of the original game are in for a real treat, but for those who didn't play the original, just playing the remake will allow you to appreciate the opening that much more. After an intense few hours, it becomes apparent that the game has made several new additions in the sequel, and they want you to know about it. In the beginning, instructions and tutorials are what you'll be spending a lot of your time on if you're new to this world. Additions worth mentioning include synergy skills, synergy abilities, folios which improve set abilities, and an expansive world filled with possibilities. Combat also had quite a few new mechanics and additions as well. Along with making your skill and abilities more accessible, they added new materia, new abilities for each character, new summons, and more weapons. Also worth noting is the flexibility you have in this game to choose your party members for most missions and side work, which is something that its predecessor did not offer. I really like this approach to the game because it led to more dynamic combat. Rotating between characters gave you a different approach when facing certain enemies. Plus, remember the synergy skills and abilities that I mentioned earlier? Well, there are certain ones that only work with specific party members. This is the game's way of encouraging players to cycle through the different characters to find out which playstyle works best for them. Each character has their own limit breaks or ultimate attacks, and you'll find yourself constantly switching up your teams and characters to obtain any advantage you can. The game also allows you to customize each one of your characters with different materia, weapons, and summoning. During my playthrough, for example, I treated Barret like a long-range tank, while Aerith had a deeper focus on magic and support. The new combat mechanics and additions will make the gameplay in Rebirth feel more polished and fun. The new materia, synergy skills, and abilities give an overall upgraded feel to the game. Graphics are also great, with the exception of some minor lighting issues here and there, but overall great. The regions are all varied and different, which is good considering that you'll be spending a lot of time in each individual one. All over the different regions, there's plenty to do and enemies to encounter, so you'll be fighting quite often. I think the bosses in this game were an improvement as well. You get more bosses to fight within the story, and they all felt unique and had their own little quirks and unique subplots. Shinra is not short on manpower, I can assure you of that. The game also offers fast travel, but if you want to explore the region you're in, you'll have the option to do it on a Choco Bird, which is this game's version of a mount. In each region, these mounts all have a different ability that help you get throughout the world in a different way, which I found to be pretty ambitious, but you'll see that traveling by Choco Bird won't be your favorite at times. Characters in the game are intriguing, and you do establish a connection of sorts as you progress through the game, with the exception of one or two characters. I feel like dialogue and delivery could have been better in certain areas, but you do see and play through some genuinely beautiful moments. I can appreciate that the game developers did make an effort to bring all these characters to life, and that they tried to tug on the emotions of its fanbase. It's pretty evident that they were trying to add real depth to the characters, by even giving some of them their own narrative and subplot, but more on that later. Outside of the general story, the game will give you plenty to do. You'll spend most of your time gathering intel for Chadley, who helps you develop new materia and obtain new summoning. If you're someone who likes challenges, Chadley will have plenty of them. The more points of intel you discover within the region, the more combat challenges you unlock in the combat simulator. This is where players will be able to hone in on their combat skills. It's also a great place to experiment with different party members and skills to see what works best for you. Minigames are also prominent in this game, with my personal favorite being Queen's Blood. If you've played The Witcher, this is this game's version of Gwent, which is a card game. You can assemble cards throughout the world and customize your deck to fit your preferred strategies. It was fun seeing your deck grow stronger as you continue defeating higher ranked NPCs throughout the game. Also, I'll say that this game does have a pretty memorable soundtrack and theme. The developers did do a good job of matching what was going on in-game with the music, which is something that can't be said for all games. Another convenient addition to the game is an item transmuter, which basically allows you to craft materials and or equipment for your team. You can prioritize what you want to create, and once the right materials are gathered, you can craft whatever you need on the spot instead of having to go to a vendor like in the last game. Equipment in this game does vary and does impact different character attributes. You can gain certain perks and benefits by using certain equipment, which gives you the freedom to retrofit your team how you see fit. Now, we've spoken about what the game does right. Now let's talk about what the game does wrong. For every one thing the game does right, it does something to absolutely frustrate me. For starters, notice I haven't really said much about the story. That's because for the majority of the game, I was just confused. This was one of the most convoluted plots I have ever played in any video game. So much so that when I finished the game in its entirety, I actually had more questions. You know it's bad if after you finish a game you have to go look up endgame explanations. Now for perspective, I put 100 hours into the entire game, and I could only come up with a semblance of a story on my own. The main protagonist, Cloud, who to me has an outrageously dull personality, is trying to find and stop his main rival, Sephiroth. To me, Sephiroth's motives were never really clear, and he was somewhat of an afterthought throughout the story. I say that because you don't really interact with Sephiroth until the last part of the game, and even then it's hard to want to stop someone if you don't really know what their intentions are. Regardless, throughout the game you see that Sephiroth has some sort of influence on Cloud's mind and judgment, which allows him to manipulate him to a certain extent. From what I was able to gather, he wanted to destroy the planet and absorb something called the life stream, which is the planet's energy, to become one with the planet and rule as a god. Also, apparently Sephiroth was genetically conceived at a lab by a scientist named Hojo, who's technically his father, who infused him with Genova cells. Genova herself was an ancient extraterrestrial being who came to Earth centuries ago. Yeah, I know it's weird, but stay with me. Shinra is the villainous power company of the game, and their goal is to attain an unlimited access to Mako energy, which they believe can be possible if Aerith, one of our main heroes, leads them to the promised land of the Cetra. The Cetra was an ancient race that were part of a deeply spiritual civilization that knew how to tap into the planet's lifestream, or energy. Shinra wants to take advantage of the last known Cetra to access said lifestream to satisfy their own corporate greed, from what I was able to gather. You also have another faction in the mix named Wutai, which opposes Shinra at every turn, but who also have their own dirty laundry to air out. Originally, Shinra wanted to put a Mako reactor in the nation of Wutai, but the nation refused, and because of that, an all-out war ensued between the two. Shinra eventually wins the war, but the nation of Wutai still opposes Shinra and continues the fight. Now, a lot of what I just finished mentioning to you, I had to look up and confirm for myself. Keep in mind, even with all of what I just mentioned, the story gets more complicated and confusing as you progress. Earlier I mentioned that the bosses in the game felt a bit more interesting because they each had their own subplots. Well, the developers tried doing this with some of the main characters as well. The problem is, it doesn't always work. While it is apparent that they wanted their audience to get to know these characters a bit better by elaborating on some of their backstories, it just didn't work. It just felt like some of the portions were rushed, and honestly, it made those overall parts of the game feel awkward and unnecessary. That's the perfect word to describe a lot of what goes on in Rebirth. You'll find this to be a common theme in the game. There's just so much unnecessary fluff within this game. So much so that at times I was questioning whether or not I'd actually finish the game. Who on the development team was responsible for making these mind-numbingly bad side quests and fetch quests? I am not kidding, and it is not an exaggeration. They were bad. There were times in the game where I genuinely thought that the developers put certain missions in the game just to be comical. I really wish the developers focused on putting in more quality side missions which deepen character relationships instead of making you do all this extra pointless busy work. Now, to be fair, there were some tolerable side missions here and there with some appeal, but most were just bad and not memorable at all, which was a huge letdown for a game with all this hype. In regards to the regions, while it is fair to say that visually they were all great and they looked great and felt different, there were two in particular that were absolute nightmares to try to get through. Anyone who has played this game will attest to how bad it was to get through the Gongana region and the Red Canyon region. They made tasks in this region extremely hard to find, and you'll find yourself wandering for hours without the help of a YouTube guide. The map isn't worth much if the layout of the region is congested and complicated to navigate through. Concerning that you will be spending quite some time in these regions, it was a real shame that they made it so difficult to complete. Now, as I've already mentioned earlier, the game does offer several mini-games to play, with the best one being Queen's Blood. Mostly every other one in the game could have been left out. They all felt like a waste of time. Fort Condor, which was a real-time strategy minigame, was tolerable, and some others were fun, but they just felt really out of place and unnecessary. Most will ruin any immersion you had in the world and its story. By the end, I counted 18 different minigames. To me, that's just excessive, and it is overkill. Yes, I could have steered clear from some of them, but even so, why put them in the game in the first place? Overall, it just felt like the game was giving you more and more busy work as you progressed, which really affected the pacing and immersion. So, let's recap. Final Fantasy Rebirth is a game that does a lot right, but also does quite a bit wrong. It has a strong foundation in the gameplay and new game mechanics, beautiful visuals, a beautiful world to explore, several different enemy types, and unique bosses that all elevate your overall experience. The game does have some genuinely great moments, and there's a certain appeal that both old and new players alike can appreciate. It starts off on a high note and piques your interest immediately. However, you will start to see things slow down significantly as you start tackling all of the mundane tasks that the game has laid out for you. Several missions felt like a waste of time, and none were really memorable, and if they were, it was for the wrong reason. Certain regions in the world were just poorly designed, and it had a complicated narrative that was hard to track. Also, the surplus of minigames really did hurt the game in my opinion because they just felt forced and out of place. And let's not forget the absolute terrible fetch quests. Overall, it just felt like the game had no real focus and was trying to wear too many hats at once. Personally, I would have liked to see higher quality side missions, a clear narrative, more personality from the main protagonist, and way less busy work. I feel like the whole entire game could have been condensed quite a bit. For those reasons, Final Fantasy Rebirth gets an overall score of a 6.8 out of 10. It is an inspired game, but it does lack in important areas. It does have heart, and there were parts that were definitely fun, but I can't help but compare it to others in its genre that just did it better. If you enjoy open world games, this might be the game for you, and if it isn't, you'll find out fairly quickly as you play through the game. If you're a fan of the original, I think you'll definitely enjoy this one, and you'll definitely see the effort that the game developers put into the game. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, be on the lookout for another video from the Video Game Guy. Thanks, guys.